Willie Nelson didn't rise through the industry in the way most stars do. His journey began in the quiet fields of Abbott, Texas, under the shadow of the Great Depression, where music was more than background noise. It was a survival instinct. Raised by his grandparents after his parents drifted apart, the rhythm of his life was shaped not by fame, but by silence, struggle, and the worn strings of a child's guitar. At 6, that guitar became a companion. At 7, he was already turning thoughts into melodies. By 9, he was on stage beside his sister Bobby, their music filling the air of dimly lit dance halls. Each note they played carved a deeper path toward something unseen but deeply felt. Life back then was a patchwork of odd jobs, long drives, and voices that told him he didn't quite fit the mold. His phrasing was too raw, too personal, for the polished Nashville sound of the time. Yet, his words, quiet, poetic and unwavering, began to travel further than he ever could. Songs like Crazy found homes in other voices, but their roots were unmistakably his. The outsider slowly became a quiet architect behind the scenes. Even when the spotlight stayed elsewhere, Willie was already shaping the soul of country music, one verse at a time. That path would twist in ways no one could predict. The 1970s didn't just mark a breakthrough, they marked a breaking point. Tired of the machine, Nelson returned to Texas, not to escape, but to rediscover what had once made music feel like breathing. There, something powerful took shape. The outlaw country movement wasn't rebellion for the sake of noise. It was rebellion born from restraint, from years of being told to soften, smooth out, conform. Albums like Shotgun Willie and Red-Headed Stranger weren't just records, they were declarations. A long-haired figure with a battered guitar and a storyteller's soul had stepped into the center frame, and he didn't ask permission to stay. Behind every song was a man who had lived every word. And with each release, the myth grew, not from image, but from truth. That truth, quiet and steady, carried him through decades of change. Through losses, through triumphs, through a world that would keep trying to define him. But Willie Nelson never needed defining. He was already writing the story in his own time, and the next chapter was just beginning to unfold. In the early years, the road ahead was anything but clear. Willie Nelson's 20s and 30s were spent wandering through odd jobs and uncertain cityscapes. He worked as a disc jockey, sold vacuum cleaners door to door, tried his hand at farming, even peddled Bible books, all while quietly chasing the sound only he seemed to hear. The polished Nashville sound had no room for his raw phrasing and unfiltered voice, but he pressed forward, carrying songs that didn't yet have a place to land. It was Crazy, recorded by Patsy Cline, that changed everything. The lyrics weren't loud, but they lingered. Nightlife and Funny How Time Slips Away soon followed, pushing open doors he wasn't invited through. By the time his name began surfacing in songwriting circles, Willie had already worn through the soles of his ambition. The recognition came slowly, and never as loud as the effort that built it. Still, the foundation was laid. And with each note that made its way into the world, Nelson came closer to the music he was meant to make. Not for others, but for himself. In the 1970s, something broke loose. Tired of chasing approval, Willie returned to Texas, where freedom took root in new form. There, the outlaw country movement found its heartbeat. Albums like Shotgun Willie, Red-Headed Stranger, and Stardust weren't just well received, they shattered expectations. With sparse arrangements and deeply personal lyrics, Nelson proved that authenticity needed no polish. Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain didn't rise because of production tricks. It rose because it was honest. And that honesty caught fire. His image, long braids, bandana, and the weather-beaten guitar trigger, became more than a look. It was the emblem of a soul that refused to yield. The industry had told him what not to be. He became something else entirely. And the people followed. He sang for those who had been overlooked, for the farmers, the wanderers, the quiet dreamers. His songs didn't explain. They understood. And with that quiet understanding, Willie Nelson became more than a musician. He became a movement. But fame was never the full picture. The man behind the music carried battles that rarely made headlines. Financial struggles weighed heavily. The IRS came down hard. Marriages came and went, each chapter shaped by both love and the cost of life on the road. His first union with Martha Matthews ended in turmoil, and the tragedy of losing their son Billy years later left a wound that never truly closed. Relationships unraveled under the pressure of relentless touring and personal demons. Yet in those same years new beginnings emerged. With Annie D'Angelo, his fourth wife and quiet anchor, stability returned. Their bond, rooted in common care, became his refuge. He cut back on drinking. He changed how he lived. They raised two sons together, Lucas and Micah, both drawn to the very force that shaped their father's life. Through the losses and through the love, Nelson kept writing. He kept singing. And in doing so, he turned a lifetime of pain, joy, and defiance into something lasting. Not just music but memory. Willie Nelson's life on stage was only part of the story. Off stage, his journey through love, loss and family was every bit as layered as his music. His first marriage to Martha Matthews began when he was still finding his voice and ended after a decade of turmoil. They had 3 children together, Lana, Susie, and Willie Billy Hugh Jr., each carrying pieces of his restless heart. But the strain of early career struggles, alcohol, and instability left scars. Years later, in 1991, tragedy struck when Billy took his own life. It was a silent ache Nelson rarely spoke of, but it never left him. He carried it in his songs, in the quiet moments between verses. His second marriage to country singer Shirley Cauley brought brief stability, but the discovery of an affair with Connie Kupka unraveled it. Connie would become his third wife, the mother of Paula and Amy, and a source of strength through difficult years. They weathered storms together, including his battles with the IRS and his own personal demons, but even that bond would eventually fracture. By 1988, a new chapter opened beside someone different. Annie D'Angelo, a makeup artist he met while filming Stagecoach, brought something he hadn't known in years: peace. Their connection grew quietly, rooted in simplicity. Annie stood by him through legal troubles, lifestyle changes, and the relentless pace of life on the road. With her, Willie found the strength to shift old patterns. He reduced his drinking. He changed how he ate. Together they had 2 sons, Lucas and Micah, both musically gifted in their own right. The family they built became a center of calm. Over time, that foundation allowed Willie to keep going, even as the years pressed forward. Their home in Maui, nestled in tropical quiet, offered him a sanctuary. It wasn't retirement. It was retreat. There, surrounded by music, family, and sunlight, he found the space to reflect. And though Annie's name is sometimes misspelled or forgotten in the headlines, she remains a constant, the quiet partner behind one of music's loudest legacies. But even as peace settled into his later life, one memory from the past returned in a new light. At 92, Willie Nelson began speaking for the first time about a connection he had rarely acknowledged publicly: his friendship with John Denver. Their paths had crossed often, but softly. Denver, with his clear voice and nature-rooted optimism, stood in contrast to Willie's outlaw image. Yet there was something unspoken between them: a shared honesty, a devotion to causes, a gentleness beneath their different styles. They appeared together at charity events and special broadcasts, but never released music as a duo. Still, the respect ran deep. Nelson described Denver as someone who sang from the mountains, a man who meant what he sang, without performance or pretense. One backstage moment stayed with him. Denver, quiet and sincere, had spoken about simply wanting to write and sing truthfully, no matter what the world expected. Those words stayed buried for decades, but Willie never forgot them. When Denver died in a plane crash in 1997, Nelson grieved in silence. There was no public tribute, no official statement. Only a quiet mourning held close to the chest. As time passed, the songs Denver left behind began to echo louder in Willie's reflections. Take Me Home, Country Roads and Sunshine on My Shoulders weren't just songs to him. They were gifts. Nelson recognized the same courage in Denver that he had always strived for in himself: the courage to stay soft, even when the world demanded hard edges. Critics called Denver sentimental, but Nelson saw strength in that sentiment. He saw truth. And in his later years, he imagined what might have been: a duet perhaps, 2 voices shaped by land, love, and stubborn authenticity. They were, in Willie's words, country boys at heart, each walking different trails toward the same horizon. And in remembering Denver now, Nelson wasn't just honoring a friend. He was honoring a version of himself that had quietly endured all along. In the twilight of a legendary career, Willie Nelson didn't slow down. He simply changed rhythm. At an age when most would step back, he leaned in. In 2014, just before turning 81, he released Band of Brothers, an album not built on nostalgia, but on new stories. It wasn't a collection of past hits or recycled ideas. It was original, it was raw, and it was unmistakably Willie. The record climbed to the top of the Billboard Top Country Albums chart, silencing those who had long written him off as a relic of a different era. Each song carried the same unfiltered soul he had always offered, but now it came from a voice that had lived through every word. The production was stripped back, the lyrics unguarded, and the delivery quiet but unwavering. Critics didn't call it a comeback, they called it a return to form. It was the sound of a man still evolving, still reaching, still unafraid of vulnerability. That same year, he stood under stage lights just as he had at 9 years old, but now with a lifetime behind him. His guitar trigger, worn from decades of playing, didn't need polish to shine. His bandana soaked up the same sweat, only now it held decades of memory. Through every verse he was telling us, there's more to say. Even now. Especially now. But music wasn't the only stage where Nelson refused to fade. His presence in film and television revealed another side of his artistry. One equally rooted in authenticity. In The Electric Horseman, acting alongside Robert Redford and Jane Fonda, he didn't just play a part. He brought his whole self to the screen. His voice, his mannerisms, his quiet humor. All of it blended seamlessly with the character, leaving an impression that went far beyond the script. From there, his presence only deepened. In Starlight, his gentle demeanor brought comfort to a new generation. He wasn't acting. He was simply being. Each role allowed a glimpse behind the music, into the man who had been shaped by love, loss, rebellion, and resilience. In The Dukes of Hazzard, his portrayal of Uncle Jesse didn't rely on force. It relied on familiarity, on the steady wisdom he'd carried for years. Later, in Blonde Ambition and Zoolander 2, he leaned into the humor of his own image, self-aware but never self-important. These appearances weren't designed to extend fame. They were quiet acknowledgments that his story had room for joy, mischief, and reflection. And audiences, no matter their age, felt that. They didn't need context. They saw something familiar in his weathered smile and steady voice. The roles shifted, but the presence remained the same. Calm, grounded, and enduring. What made this era so poignant was not the fame or the accolades. It was the quiet grace with which Nelson carried it all. With Annie by his side and his children forging their own creative paths, Willie had found something elusive: balance. Lucas, leading his own band, echoed his father's storytelling in every performance. Micah, unpredictable and inventive, carved his own identity, yet still traced lines back to Willie's eclectic spirit. Together, they became reflections, not copies, of the legacy their father had built. Willie watched them grow from a distance that felt close, from stages and sound checks, knowing the music had found new voices. At home in Maui, far from the touring buses and hotel rooms, life moved slower. Surrounded by tropical green and ocean wind, he finally had space to breathe. Yet even there, melodies would rise in the stillness. A lyric. A memory. A whisper of a story yet to be told. For a man who had given so much to the world, this phase was not silence. It was a softer song. A deeper note. And through it all, he remained himself, unshaped by fame, untouched by pretense. His story, still unfolding, carried the weight of everything that came before. And in that weight there was peace. In these later years, Willie Nelson's reflections have grown deeper, more deliberate. The pace of his life may have slowed, but his thoughts continue to stretch back across the decades. It was during one of those quiet stretches, when the road was far behind and the music temporarily paused, that he finally spoke about someone whose story had run alongside his own: John Denver. Their bond hadn't been public. It hadn't needed to be. But beneath the surface, there was a shared rhythm, a mutual respect that had endured in silence. Denver had walked a different path, filled with nature, light, and soaring melodies, but his intentions mirrored Willie's: honest, unwavering, and deeply human. Willie never forgot that. And as time pressed forward, he began to see the quiet bravery in Denver's choices with a kind of clarity that only age could bring. The music they made separately now sounded like echoes of one another. Not in sound, but in spirit. And that spirit lingered. Nelson's words, when he finally shared them, weren't grand or performative. They were gentle. He saw strength in Denver's softness. He heard defiance in the simplicity of songs like Sunshine on My Shoulders. And in those moments of looking back, something long held inside came to the surface. There was no duet, no shared album, no formal collaboration between them. And yet, The possibility of what could have been now carries its own weight. Nelson imagined a moment, maybe late in life, maybe in another world, where their voices might have met, where their shared love for the earth, for people, for truth, might have filled the same room. He didn't dwell on the absence of it. He honored the presence that had existed all along. Their parallel paths, though never formally joined, had often moved side by side. At televised charity events, at quiet backstage corners, they crossed, exchanged words, understood each other in ways that didn't require explanation. Willie remembered a conversation where Denver spoke about writing honestly, regardless of industry pressures. That stayed with him. It wasn't advice. It was affirmation. Nelson had lived his life by the same compass. Through every challenge, IRS battles, lost marriages, personal demons, he stayed honest. That honesty, so rare in an industry that often demands compromise, became the bridge between them. Denver may have left the world too soon, but in Nelson's quiet tribute, he became part of the story once more. Not a footnote. A reflection. Now at 92, with over 100 albums behind him and a legacy sealed in both awards and memories, Willie Nelson continues forward. Not as a man clinging to the past, but as someone shaped by it, softened by it, and still strengthened by the music it inspired. His life, long and uneven, has always been about movement, from Texas to Nashville to Maui, from obscurity to myth. But even in stillness, his voice carries. Even in reflection, there is forward motion. His songs remain warm and weathered, full of presence, never performance. The quiet recollection of his bond with Denver wasn't about closure. It was about continuation. The music endures, not because of fame, but because it was real. Because it was lived. Family surrounds him. Memories fill the air. And somewhere in the calm of a Hawaiian morning, a guitar string hums softly under his fingers. That string holds a lifetime. And every note it plays now is one more step in a journey that never really ends. It only changes tempo.